little personal. Over 30 years ago, when I was a young high school kid living at Naval Air Station, Alameda, California, my father, here with us today, was Commander of Carrier Group 7, and our next door neighbor was the commanding officer of USS Coral Sea, Stan Arthur, Captain Stan Arthur at the time. His son Derek was one of my best friends, and Mrs. Arthur, Jenny Lou, was like a mom to me. I admired Captain Arthur, and I wanted to be an attack pilot just like him. Sorry, Dad, he's a fighter pilot. I thought attack was the way to go. 15 years later, I was a lieutenant on the OPNAV staff at the Pentagon, and Admiral Arthur was the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. I was grateful for the time he gave me and the interest he showed in my career, and I got to make a couple of office calls on the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great honor to be standing here today, now as a retired Navy captain, to be able to introduce a friend and a genuine naval aviation hero, a combat pilot with over 500 missions in North Vietnam, and the recipient of 11 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Admiral Stan Arthur.
Despite my efforts, he turned out pretty good. I'm the last of the Mohicans here today, so I'll talk to you about Vietnam and the Gulf War. My perspective is that I made 5 deployments to the Tonkin Gulf in a period of 6 years, from 1966 through September of '72. And for the Gulf War, I was embarked on the good flagship USS Blue Ridge at sea in the Persian Gulf. 2 very different wars, and viewed from 2 very different venues. One from the cockpit and one from a senior leadership position. When I say 2 very different wars, that doesn't mean there were not similarities. Both were based on a struggle for defining a country's boundaries, and both had the dates of 2 and 5 August in common. On 2 August 1964, USS Maddox reported an encounter with 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats. And on 2 August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. In response to these events, the U.S. made major changes in its posture, and we'll talk a little bit about what happened. In response to the Maddox event, President Johnson, armed with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, ordered retaliatory strikes. During the morning of 5 August, USS Constellation and USS Ticonderoga launched a total of 64 aircraft. Assigned targets were patrol boats, bases, and a large fuel storage facility. On that day, we lost the 1A-1 Skyraider with its pilot, and an A-4 Charlie with pilot Lieutenant Ed Alvarez becoming our first POW. And thus began the start of a long, protracted period of air operations in support of the Vietnam conflict. It should be noted that the Navy utilized 21 different carriers, making 86 combat deployments in Vietnam. In response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, President Bush declared on 5 August that disaggression against Kuwait, quote, would not stand, unquote. Operation Desert Shield was established on 7 August, and the build-up to Desert Storm was underway. USS Independence was on station in the Gulf of Oman, and the next day USS Eisenhower was on station in the Red Sea. Just like in Vietnam, the Navy had 2 carriers ready for combat. During Desert Shield, we utilized 8 carriers. Ike and Indy were relieved later by Midway and Saratoga. Of the 6 carriers on station for Desert Storm, 5 of those carriers had participated in Vietnam. One outlier was the 1 nuke, and it wasn't Teddy, it wasn't Theodore, we called it TR. It should be noted that if these 8 carriers involved between Desert Shield and Desert Storm represented 2/3 of our carrier force. The availability of such a high percentage of this force was because of the lessons from Vietnam. During that time, we ran our carrier force into the ground with deferred maintenance and insufficient turnaround time, and to conduct the proper training. A major lesson learned, and one that is still being tweaked today. It should be recognized that the U.S. had been actively involved in Vietnam since 1956, and thus the run-up to the heavy air engagement in 1964 was during a period of long tide shifts in the political atmosphere out in that region. In Desert Storm, we had a 5.5-month period of Desert Shield for preparations before the start of Operation Desert Storm air campaign. When one looks at Vietnam, we had the benefit of the lessons learned from World War II and Korea. We enjoyed a fleet of modern aircraft, as was just mentioned, and all of the aircraft were past their initial introduction. So all of them had known combat capabilities. We weren't looking at them for the first time. The A-1 Skyraider as attack platform was rapidly retired because the AAA environment and the SAM environment just did not, was just an overmatch for their survivability. The A-3 Sky Warrior had been modified from being a one-way trip bomber to tanking and the ever-important EW roles. The prop-driven E-1 AEW platform, the Willie Fuzz, was being replaced by the turboprop E-2 on the big decks, as were the F-8 Crusaders being replaced by the F-4 Phantom. And the only all-weather attack airplane in either the Air Force or the Navy, the A-6A, also resided on our big decks. The trusty A-4s and the brand new A-7, starting in 1967, filled the rest of the deck spots, and each was continually upgraded from one deployment to the next. In the ordnance world, we were also going through modifications. There had been a long recognized need for precision-guided munitions. We started off with the bullpup, a visually guided missile, where you tried to fly your airplane and fly the missile at the same time. And Walleye, a glide bomb that locked onto its target through a TV camera. And although we had some dramatic successes with these weapons, they became very unattractive in a high-threat environment because you spent too much time wing level trying to get lined up and guide these things. So we tried them out. They worked a little bit, but we didn't rely on them very much. Towards the end of the conflict in '72, laser-guided bombs made their appearance. The Air Force had designators for the lasers. Navy did not. But we could carry the bombs. Eventually, we had one A-4 squadron that had laser spot trackers in the nose of the A-4, and we borrowed two Marine combat configured two-seat A-4s. I had China Lake build little black box handheld designator, and so we could go and play the game ourselves, designate our own targets and drop our own LGBs. We learned a lot from that experience. Sadly, the Air Force learned that lesson much better than the Navy, as we'll see later on. But one of the major developments made during the war was Navy China Lake's development of the Shrike anti-radiation missile. Until it arrived in theater, the duel between aircraft and the SAM sites was accomplished with rockets and bombs, and it was not an even fight. When the Shrike showed up, we could now shut down the radars, and we were in business. We always had what we called iron hand aircraft, which were A-4s or A-7s, with strike missiles only, no bombs, and their job was to keep the radar shut down, and they did a magnificent job. From that point on, we never went into Indian country without an iron hand escort. So Vietnam provided a great training ground, and we later were able to utilize on Desert Storm. In the air-to-air game in Vietnam, we had very capable Sidewinder missiles, and they were aggressively updated throughout that campaign. We also had the Sparrow beyond visual range radar missile. Very checkered history at the time with the avionics and high moisture in the Gulf of Tonkin region. But our biggest problem was rules of engagement. For some unknown reason, we spent the whole Vietnam War with an ROE that said we could not shoot beyond visual range. You had to be in sight at all times. And so we lost a lot of capability that we had. Another lesson learned from Vietnam was the need for accurate and timely battle damage assessment. We had dedicated assets aboard the carriers. The big decks had the RA-5C Vigilantes, and the small decks, we had the RF-8 Crusaders. Not only did these assets perform routine reconnaissance missions, but they also provided a post-strike pass-through the target area to provide real-time BDA when we got back to the ship and dispel all those announcements by us guys that were dropping bombs, that we put everything right on target. But there was nothing like being the last guy through the target area after everybody else had alerted everybody, all the gunners, that here we were. And so the last guy through had a very interesting pass. And we decided then and there that there had to be a better way to get BDA. Several attempts were made. We converted target drones into recce platforms, shoot them out over the beach, and they report back what they've seen. We invaded the ASW world and snatched the ASW Hilo, the Dash. It was supposed to go over the horizon and drop a torpedo. We decided to put sensors on it, send it over the beach, and watch what the trucks are doing at night. And they were able to record their own shoot down. On 15 January 1973, President Nixon ordered the halt of U.S. offensive operations in Vietnam. On 12 February, Operation Homecoming begins, and our 179 POWs came home. Our carriers lost 530 aircraft to combat and an additional 329 to operational causes. We lost 377 aviators with another 64 missing in action. The biggest issue for those of us that flew in Vietnam was the targeting process. For the first 4 years, the targets were assigned at a weekly Tuesday lunch hosted by President Johnson. Often, there was not even a military representative at the table for that lunch. Later, targeting was moved to the SINC, out the SINC pack, but the Washington input was more prevalent than the voice from on scene. We went through series after series of bombing halts, and so those of us in the cockpit, we understood what our job was, we knew what target we were going to go to on that day, but we had absolutely no conception of what the strategy was. We were just taxi drivers, all in orphans. As mentioned earlier, Operation Desert Shield commenced the buildup and planning for Operation Desert Storm. One of the greatest strengths brought to the planning and execution of Desert Shield, Desert Storm was the fact that all of the component commanders and the SINC had served in combat during the Vietnam conflict. There was a shared agreement among us that we were not going to screw this up. There were plenty of parochial issues that came up, but in the end, we made sure that the execution of the plan was as best as possible. One of the big things we had working for us is that we knew exactly what the end state should look like. Simply Iraq out of Kuwait. goals for Desert Shield as we started the buildup were also relatively straightforward. Develop a defensive capability to defer further attacks, defend Saudi Arabia if that deterrence failed, build a military effective coalition, and integrate it into the operational plans, finally enforce economic sanctions described by the UN Security Resolutions 661 and 665. The enforcement of the sanctions resulted requiring the naval forces to get into the maritime interception business. Needless to say, this was not as easy as it sounds, and after many false starts, we finally determined what Washington would accept as an appropriate level of force to stop a suspect ship. Although a good routine was established, each ship was a different adventure. It is easy to say that you will shoot to disable a civilian vessel, but it is a much different thing to do it. The coalition forces at sea performed magnificently during these operations. Without the VP aircraft and the helos and the trusty Coast Guard who were with us at all times on that evolution, that task would have been next to impossible. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the planning that went on was relative to the use of air power. Initially, the air defense posture had to be set to protect the flow of people and equipment into the theater. And of course, the Navy was on scene to do that at the beginning. And then as other forces rolled in, we transitioned to a coalition force to do the force protection. The SINC had designated the Air Force Component Commander as the JFAC, the Joint Air Component Commander. Although this fit with the then current doctrine, it was the first time it had ever been utilized at this level of the game. I could probably spend all day talking about all the ramifications of trying to work our way through this. But needless to say, we found a way to do it, and we went off to make it work. History will show, if you go back and start reading at the end of World War II, the establishment of the Air Force, the one key element that they had been working on for that whole time was to get this dictum that says the Air Force guy on station becomes the Joint Force Air Component Commander, and he will run the air picture. Interesting to note, after from World War II clear up to this 1990, although that had been their game, when it came time to execute it, they didn't have a method to do it. The Air Force had a whole collage of systems. The one that they liked best was called CAPTAINS, which was Computer Assisted Force Management System, an interactive computer network that would allow people at various places to input and output and finally develop a plan. Not all the Air Force had it. Certainly the Navy didn't have it. Marines didn't have it. Army didn't have it. But away we went to make this work. And in the absence of fiber optic telephone lines trailing every ship, the Navy did not have enough SATCOM capability to bring it aboard. So we relied on airplanes flying out of Riyadh to the nearest shore base to the Gulf on either side, Red Sea and Persian Gulf. And then we'd have helos based there to bring them out to the carrier, and then the carrier dispense them to the AAW ships. Bill Berg would have loved it. We also thought that the 72-hour planning cycle seemed a huge step backward from what the Navy was used to doing. We sort of planned overnight. This way we had to think 72 hours ahead of time what it was we wanted to do, and it did not work quite as well as we thought. The other problem that started was the same thing that happened in Vietnam. The campaign was starting to be planned in Washington. And God bless General Chuck Horner, who was the JFAC out in theater, who found out that the air staff was building his campaign. And he went to General Schwarzkopf and said, if I'm the JFAC, I plan the campaign. And so we brought all the guys in the secret Air Force cell in Washington out to theater, and we started planning it out in our bailiwick. Navy input to this was non-existent in Washington. Once it got in theater, we had some input, but not all of our words were fully understood. But again, we made it work. For us, the biggest success, and this will sound strange, was that we were able to get the Tomahawk missile system cranked into the air tasking on the first night. Downtown Baghdad. The reason we thought it was important to get that in was Navy Air still did not have a first day downtown capability. We had no stealth, and we felt that we had demonstrated that the Navy could participate from day one, whether it be from Navy Air or whether it be from tactical missiles launched from ships and submarines. And they were fortunate that we were so insistent to get that done. Because on the early morning hours of 17 January, USS San Jacinto launched the first of the Tomahawks to start the air campaign. In the first 24 hours, Tomahawks hit 39 targets, and the F-117s 14. In the second 24 hours, the Tomahawks hit 18, and the F-117 1. Stealth aircraft could fly, but the weather had moved in, and so they were dropping LGBs. LGBs couldn't see spot on the ground, so the F-117s were useless. Big lesson learned for all of us should be, if you're going to have stealth delivery platforms, you better have some missiles that can fly in all weather. And we're still working at it. The other issue that we had was our data links. We only had one excursion that caused us some concern with an Iraqi plane that sort of flew down the scene, and luckily the Saudis were able to intercept it. But both the AWACS and our AAW ships had a time delay in their picture. So this guy was weaving through a time delay. One time AWACS would have it, one time we would have it. Luckily, the ground station that the AWACS was pumping down to for the Saudis was able to track this guy continuously. We had built a data link with a picture that showed all the way from the Red Sea all the way over to the Persian Gulf. So we went Aegis cruiser in the Red Sea, up to E2, over to AWACS, down to the ground, back up to E2, back down to an Aegis cruiser. We thought we had a picture, but the picture had time delays. Many of us that play with computers know when things get a little boxed up, you don't always read it as fast, and that happened. We were lucky that the aggressor did not understand that. And again, as in Vietnam, our Navy fighters were marginalized. Rules of engagement, once again, prevented the F-14 from using the Phoenix missile. Also, let every aircraft not use a beyond visual range missile. But we were able to eventually argue the point that for a specific corridor, the F-14s ought to be able to shoot if on a designated target. They finally agreed, but it never showed up in the ATO, so we were ever to fly it. So once again, ROE is a significant task that has to be worked out very carefully. We talk about the precision-guided missiles, weapons. Many people, I think, come away from Desert Storm thinking that PGMs were the name of the game. In reality, only 9% of the ordnance we dropped in the Persian Gulf were precision-guided munitions. However, those 9% achieved 75% of the real combat destruction that we needed done. So, although we didn't do a lot with PGMs, what we did with them really counted. And one of the things that we now need to understand is that 9% of our ordnance that was precision guided accounted for 75% of the total cost of the weapons we utilized. The Navy flew over 60% of all the coalition and allied suppression of enemy air defense missions. We launched 33% of all the HARMS. HARMS was the predator followed along to the strike missile from Vietnam. And it had a significant step-up capability over the strike. Also had a very, very expanded envelope. It also led to 6 fratricide incidents, with one of them attributed to a Navy shooter. So we had to learn a little bit more about harm. All in all, the Navy was the leader in the SEAD game. And the Navy also brought the only air-launched decoys to the battle. Armed helos made their presence felt in Desert Storm. The Army Hellfire missile proved that armed helo was more than a match against the Iraqi armor. One Army Apache unit scored 102 hits with an expenditure of 107 missiles. For the Ward C, we brought Army OH-58s onto our frigates so that they have a forward firing capability, and they use those to clear off some oil platforms and also to get a bunch of folks to surrender on one of the islands. The Royal Navy Lynx helicopter had the Sea-Skew missiles, which were very deadly. They had 14 hits for 15 expended. However, they couldn't find targets, but we had SH-60s that could find targets, and so we married them up in a hunter-killer team. And now, Navy's finally recognized that we've got armed helos, which are something you always want to have. Surprisingly enough, too bad Secretary Lehman's not here, the Iowa-class battleship showed up one more time with feeling. We used them very successfully because they also had Tomahawk missiles, which they participated in the Tomahawk shoots. They had Harpoon, which we weren't able to use. But we used them to cement the thought in the Iraqis' mind that we were going to do an amphibious operation. And unlike in Vietnam, when I flew gunfire spotting support from New Jersey up in North Vietnam, trolling around under an overcast trying to spot 16-inch rounds for the battleship was not a very good life expectancy option. But we were doing it, and luckily, again, because Secretary Lehman during his time said, I want the battleships back, and I want Pioneer RPVs to spot for them. We made it work, and then we found other uses for the Pioneer. We did put them over the beach. We did put them out in the minefields to watch for the guys laying mines when they wouldn't let us fly our B-3s and S-3s. So we made good use. And certainly, if you're looking for persistence, RPVs make a big difference. So the world of putting something overhead doesn't need to be manned as long as it can look 24/7. That's a big help. 5 weeks after the air campaign, the ground attack was executed. 100 hours later, we ended it. The plan was executed, I think, successfully. Desired results were achieved. And that statement reflects and is a testament to the young men and women who executed their assigned tasks to near perfection. They really did an extraordinary job. For those of us a little higher up in the food chain, I thought we did a little bit better job of shaping the game than what we had seen when we were youngsters out in Vietnam. But there was still plenty of more work to be done. I'm pleased to see that those efforts continue. And in response to the distinguished panel that was here earlier talking about 50 years and beyond, my prediction for the future says the last tactical aircraft the U.S. will build will have a tailgate.